the Fed actually acted this week. Is the Fed getting its arms around inflation finally?
I think the Fed's moving in the right direction. I think that's a good thing. Whether they're moving strongly enough and whether it's going to be enough to bring inflation durably under control, I think is still very much in question. You know, the labor market is looking very, very tight. The JOLTS data showed even higher ratio of vacancies to unemployed than we'd had before. And so I think there are still very real challenges ahead of us. I'm not sure the Fed needed to be quite as prescriptive with respect to what it was going to do in the future as it was. So I still think we've got a very difficult challenge ahead of us, and we're still in very turbulent waters.
Well, to that point, Larry, were you surprised when the chair, Jay Powell, essentially took off the table 75 basis point rate hike?
I was surprised that he took it off the table as firmly as he did, and in the same couple of paragraphs started talking about core CPI having come down and hinted towards the possibility that at some point they'd be able to move to 25s. Those things could happen, but I think the lesson of the last year and a half is that we can't predict, and therefore we mostly do damage to credibility when in official circles we make strong predictions.
Niall, you're a noted historian of the economy, of financial matters. If we look back at history, the historical track record of central banks being able to deal with this kind of inflation without going into recession is not particularly a happy one.
Well, David, I thought we'd learnt the lessons of the 1970s, but it seems like at some point we forgot them again. In the 1970s, of course, the Fed sought to tighten, but would periodically lose heart and blink. And for more than a decade, monetary policy failed to get on top of an inflation problem. It's not an exactly perfect analogy, but there are a couple of things that are really striking to me. One is that this problem began with an error of monetary and fiscal policy, which Larry, of course, pointed out in February of last year. But then, as happened in the 70s, we get a geopolitical shock on top of that initial policy mistake, and inflation expectations are then away and unanchored. And in this sense, I think the war in Ukraine is performing a similar role to the war of 1973 in the Middle East, which, remember, administered a shock not only to oil prices, but also to food prices. So in that sense, I think the analogy is quite good. And I agree with Larry. I don't think the Fed has nearly done enough, and it has a hard road ahead. It's also going to come under pressure at some point to blink if we continue to see the stock market selling off, the bond market is in trouble, and we have a much more complex and large financial system than we had in the 1970s, with a much higher stock of debt. Therefore, it's more sensitive to interest rate moves. So it's a long and, I think, very rugged road ahead for the Fed.
Larry, Niall quite appropriately says we have the geopolitics of all of this on top of what we've seen with the pandemic, and then, of course, with this inflation and extraordinary fiscal and monetary stimulus. Talk about the geopolitics and where we are in geopolitics. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, after Soviet Union collapsed, we thought we had a new Pax Americana. That's lasted a reasonably short period of time. We're now actually sort of in a post-Cold War era. What does that look like in terms of the economy?
David, let me just say first that I think Niall got it exactly right. One thing he said that I'm not so sure of is that the economy is more sensitive to interest rates than it was in the 1970s. I think part of that complexity that we're seeing in the economy means there's no longer the kind of credit rationing that there was in the 1970s. And so I suspect that it may take even more action from interest rates, especially in light of the fact that higher interest rates now push up interest payments on government debt more than they did, which increases spending power. So that question on the relative sensitivity of interest rates, I'm not sure of. Look, I think we're in a different geopolitical era. You know, at some point we'll call it something, rather than just calling it the post-Cold War era.
Larry, I don't Cold War II. I mean, we're kind of in Cold War II.
Neil thinks it is Cold War II. He may well turn out to be right in that judgment. I have a sense that it's going to be more multipolar than Cold War I was. I think that the single most neglected fact of the last decade was the 38 meetings that took place between Premier Xi and Premier Putin. That's more than in a decade the U.S. president has ever met with any head of state from any other country, and it's not like China and Russia are close to each other. And so that kind of realignment is a big deal. What's also a big deal now, and I think a much bigger deal than it was during the Cold War, is that there are these global security threats like climate change, like proliferation, like terrorism that make the equation much more complicated than it was during the Cold War.
Neil, obviously Russia looms large right at the moment. There is a war going on, after all, in Ukraine, and the world in various ways is responding to that. But I dare say when it comes to the economy, U.S. relations with China will be much more important going forward. What is going on with China right now? Larry talked about the relationship with Russia, but also in its economy itself, as it continues to have lockdowns, it continues to have a lot of troubles. How bad off is the Chinese economy?
Well, David, let me start with the Cold War II analogy. My point is that in this second Cold War, China's the senior partner and Russia's the junior partner. At the beginning of Cold War I, it was the other way round, but they were just as close at the beginning of the first Cold War. And in this Cold War, the hot war has broken out in Europe, in Ukraine. In the first Cold War, it was Korea. So I think there's really quite a good analogy here. The problem for China is that amidst this geopolitical crisis, they're still battling COVID. And after the hubris of claiming that they had solved the problem, unlike us incompetent Westerners, they now face nemesis in the form of the Omicron variant, which their zero-COVID policy is really struggling to contain. So if you look at mobility data in China, it's not quite as bad as it was in early 2020, but it's pretty bad. And so the Chinese economy is really in an extremely impeded state because of the restrictions that they're having to impose, not only in Shanghai, but multiple cities. What's interesting, and I'd like to throw this at Larry actually, is what does this mean for inflation? I mean, my sense is that the reduction of Chinese demand for oil is probably on net good from the vantage point of those worried about monetary policy and inflation, because it takes a little bit of the heat out of demand for oil and therefore the price of energy. I don't know if that's your view, Larry.
My guess is that China is going to be less big deal for inflation than many people think, because there are two effects. There's the demand destruction for commodity effect that you mentioned, and there's the interfered with supply chains effect that others focus on. I can't figure out which one's bigger, and since I can't figure out which one's bigger, I kind of suspect they're probably not that far from being in equipoise. I do think there's a chance that if China gets past this, you're going to see some big surge in demand from China for oil before you see the supply chains fix themselves completely. And I think that the effect of everybody trying to shorten their supply chain is going to be permanently at least a little bit inflationary.